Hello, everyone. This is Rabbi Yitschak Rudomin, and I'd like to spend some time discussing the meaning of Chanukah, trying to present some facts about the history of Chanukah, and then some of the laws and customs of Chanukah, and then getting into a discussion of the deeper meaning of Chanukah and how Chanukah is rooted in the Torah and is an integral part of Judaism, and how it becomes an eternal festival that has been celebrated for over 2,000 years and originally declared and instituted by the rabbinical sages, the Jewish rabbinical sages of Judaism and of the Torah. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to do is go over a timeline, a historical timeline from this wonderful book. It's called The Hidden Lights, Chanukah and the Jewish-Greek Conflict by Rabbi Pinchas Stolper. He was the founder of the National Conference of Synagogue Youth of the Orthodox Union, and then he became the executive director of the Orthodox Union, a very brilliant man, brilliant speaker, brilliant scholar, and he's written a number of books. And this one is about the struggle between the Jews and the Greeks and the deeper meanings of Chanukah. If you're able to get hold of it, it's put out by David Dove Publications, a private publication company. And, try get it on Amazon or wherever if you have access to a Jewish bookstore. He's also written another work called Chanukah in a New Light. Chanukah in a New Light, which is he calls it Chanukah in a New Light, grandeur, heroism, and depth, as revealed through the writings of Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner. Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner died in 1980, and he was the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Rabbi Chaim Berlin and the teacher and rabbi of Rabbi Stolper. So let's take a look at this timeline that he gives us here in the book. Chanukah dateline, chronology from the destruction of the first temple to the destruction of the second temple. It's important to understand the historical context of Chanukah, and it's also important to understand that Chanukah is very much a historical festival, applicable even in modern times. And he starts out with that in 440 BCE, before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar ascends to the throne of Babylon. So they were the ones who invaded Judea. The kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians, and it resulted in the 10 lost tribes. Then what was left was the kingdom of Yehuda, Judah, which later became known as Judea. And in 432 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar destroys the first temple, beginning the Babylonian exile of 70 years. Now, other historians give the date as 586 BCE, and there is some discussion, according to Torah sources and according to historical sources, as to exactly when the destruction of the Jewish temple occurred. But it was Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians that destroyed the first Jewish temple. Then they are succeeded by the Persians, the Medians and the Persians. Media and Persia were a world empire that existed, and one of their kings was Achashverosh, as we have it in the Megillah of Esther. I think in English it's Xerxes. And you have the story of Purim that takes place, and then the Persian king Darius gives permission for the Jewish people to return to rebuild the second temple, and they return, and there still remains a exile community in the Persian Empire, Persian/Babylonian Empire. In 310 BCE is the beginning of the Greek era, when Alexander the Great conquers the Persian Empire. Now, Alexander died at the age of 33, and his generals divided his empire. And what applies to the Jewish people is that there were two empires on either side of Judea, of Eretz Yisrael. To the south was the Ptolemaic Empire. One of the generals was Ptolemy, and he created a dynasty of Ptolemaic kings. In fact, later there were also queens called Cleopatra, and the most famous one was Cleopatra, the last queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty. They were actually Greeks before the Romans took over. And then to the north of Israel, to the north of Judea, was the Seleucid Empire, the Seleucid Greek Empire, and they also had a series of kings called Seleucid, and then there was also the king Antiochus, and there was rivalry between these two empires, and Israel, Judea, was caught in the middle. At one time, the Ptolemaic Empire of Egypt ruled Israel, had control over the Jews and the land of Eretz Israel, and that was then followed by the control of the Seleucids from the north in Syria. So the Ptolemaic Empire is in the Egyptian section, and the Seleucids are in the Syrian section to the north, and each tried to conquer the Jews in different ways. The Ptolemaic put a big emphasis on cultural Hellenization and assimilation of the Jews, whilst the Seleucids were more into militaristic and the conquering mentality. And that's part of the Chanukah story of how they suppressed the Jews, and then the Jews fought back in the times of the Maccabees. In 313 BCE, the Egyptian Ptolemaic Greek dynasty ruled Eretz Yisrael. But by 199 BCE, about 150 years later, 125 years later, Antiochus III, also called Antiochus the Great, sign of the Seleucid Greek dynasty and ruler of Syria, wrests Eretz Yisrael from Egypt. So that happened in 199 BCE, that the Seleucids took over control of Eretz Yisrael, also known as Judea. And then the Romans enter into the history. But before then, in 168 BCE, so it's about 30 years from the time that Antiochus took over ruling Israel, Eretz Yisrael, that they desecrated the temple and introduced worship of the Greek gods, the Greek, like Zeus and these kind of gods that they worshipped. And the Jews fought back, and you have in 165 BCE the conquest of temple by the Hasmoneans, the Hashmonaim, that's a family of priests, and the miracle of Chanukah. And then there's another Antiochus the fourth and the fifth, and there's a Demetrius, there's a whole series of Greek kings, and the Maccabees are fighting them. There are a series of wars between the Jews of Judea and the Greek Seleucids, and eventually the Jews managed to push out the Greeks after a lot of vicious fighting. These battles are recorded in the book of Maccabees. It's not part of the Tanakh, it's not part of the Torah. The Christian New Testament has it, but the first, and there are many different books of the Maccabees, but the first, I think it's the first 2 or 3 or 4 books of Maccabees are reliable, certainly the first 2. And these books record the battles of the Jews and the battles between the Greeks and the Jews at that time. By 140 BCE, the Sanhedrin and the people proclaimed Shimon prince of the Jews. There were a series of Maccabees that were killed from the high priest family of Matisyahu. There was first Yehuda, and then there was Shimon, and he is declared the high priest. And then in 63 BCE, the Roman consul Pompey conquers Jerusalem. There was an internal dispute between the rulers of the Hasmonean dynasty. And the rulers of the Hasmonean dynasty, it lasted about 150 years. And they were Shimon, Yochanan Hyrcanus, Yehuda Aristobulus, Alexander Yanai, Queen Alexandra, Hyrcanus, and Aristobulus. So there were a series of kings from the Hasmonean high priest family that ruled Eretz Yisrael. And it's actually against Jewish law because only a king from the house of David, from the Davidic line, should be a ruler of the Jewish people. But they usurped that, and it caused problems. But we'll see how it's rooted in the Torah literature. So that's a little bit of the historical timeline. And then, of course, the Romans, they tried to impose their idol worship on the Jews. There was a rebellion, and there were Jewish-Roman wars that went on for a long time. And eventually the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple. There were wars even after the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple. And eventually, after destroying the temple, destruction of Second Temple by the Romans, he has the date here, 68 CE, some give it as 70 of the Common Era. The Jews are sent into exile. Okay, so that's an outline of the history. The next book I'd like to use to present the laws and customs. We've now touched a little bit on of the history. I'd like to go into the laws and customs is by Rabbi David Feinstein, the son of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who wrote this wonderful abbreviated book about the Jewish calendar, and he gives explanations by Jewish months. The festival of Chanukah occurs in the Jewish month of Kislev. So he has here an explanation of a little bit of background and the laws and customs. Chanukah, beginning on the 25th of Kislev and continuing for 8 days, the rabbinically ordained festival of Chanukah is observed. He brings that from the Shulchan Aruch, from the Code of Jewish Law. Chanukah commemorates the defeat of the Syrian Greek regime, which imposed cruel anti-religious decrees against the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael. Under the reign of King Antiochus, during the Second Temple era, the foreign overlords of the land attempted to impose their pagan worship on the Jews. They contaminated the Beis HaMikdash, that's the Jewish temple, and turned it into a temple of idolatry. Among the righteous Kohanim, that's the priests, the priestly families, who exiled themselves from Jerusalem were Matisyahu and his sons, from the family of the Hashmonaim. Later also known as the Maccabees. They're called the Maccabees. Yehuda Maccabee means Yehuda, Judah, the hammer, because they literally hammered the Greeks. They fought them with a lot of strength and bravery and heroism and defeated the Greeks. The elderly Matisyahu rallied the people to rebel against the Syrian Greeks. He died soon after, but his sons carried on the struggle and won a series of miraculous victories over the vastly superior enemy forces. Finally, they took over the Beis HaMikdash and began the task of purifying it. They set up a temporary menorah, that's a candelabrum, and searched for ritually pure olive oil, one that had the seal of the high priest, that it was pure, because the Greeks had contaminated everything in the temple. Only one flask, one little jar, a single night's worth supply could be found, and it would be 8 days before acceptable oil could be prepared and brought to the Beis HaMikdash. Rather than not perform the mitzvah of the menorah for 8 days, they kindled the menorah on the 25th of Kislev, 25th of the month of the Hebrew month of Kislev, and miraculously, the one-day supply of oil burned for 8 days until the new oil arrived. In recognition of this miracle, the sages proclaimed an 8-day holiday which serve to celebrate not only the miracle of the oil, but also the miracle of the victory over the Syrian Greek army. They recognize that because the Jews fought for Hashem's Torah and mitzvahs, he helped them against all odds. And that's also from Talmud Shabbos and the Mishnah Brura. Now, point one, the sages named the holiday Chanukah. Why did they name it Chanukah? Which has a double meaning. Literally, the word means dedication, like Chanukah Samizbeach, the dedication of the altar and of the tabernacle. As Chanukah commemorates the altar's rededication, it's a rededication. Chanukah is also a combination of the word Chanu and Ka, which means they rested on the 25th day of Kislev, because on that day there was a pause in the struggle for freedom from oppression. And there's another meaning to Chanukah. It's related to the Hebrew word chinuch, education, because the Greeks try to assimilate the Jews and suppress their education. And so the Jewish sages rededicated themselves. And after the era of the Greeks came the era of the oral law and the Talmud that flourished. And that's a form of rededication of education that came out as a result of Chanukah. Next point, Chanukah is celebrated by lighting the menorah every evening, by reciting Hallel every morning. Hallel is a prayer of praise in the Jewish prayer book, and by adding Al Hanisim upon the miracles is another additional prayer in the Jewish prayers to every Shemona Esrei and Birkas Hamazon. And then there's Torah readings, and the way we light the Chanukah menorah is on the first night 1 candle or 1 light, second night 2 lights, third night 3, and each time we light, we also have what's known as a shamis, an additional light that's used for the lighting. We don't light the Chanukah candles with a Chanukah candle. We light it with a different candle called a shamis. So really on the first night, you're going to get 1 Chanukah candle and then a shamis. There'll be a second candle standing there to the side or put in at the side that is used for the lighting of the candles. So that's basically it as far as laws and customs. Of course, there are celebrations like the eating of foods in oil, like latkes, fried potato pancakes fried in oil, the eating of sufganiyot, donuts, because donuts are fried in oil. That's the way you make a donut. You take the dough and you fry it in oil. And or French fries even, it's something that's fried in oil, or fried chicken. People eat fried chicken that's fried in oil to commemorate the miracle of the oil. So we ingest through eating something with an oily food. And there's customs of a dreidel, spinning a top, giving out Chanukah geld. There's all these little customs. Each one has a deeper meaning. There are Hasidic interpretations. Every teacher, every lecturer, every person will have different interpretations that they prefer and that they stress. But this is the basic festival. The lighting of the Chanukah lights is the most important. That's the mitzvah. That's what the rabbis decreed. And it's semi-festive. In other words, you're allowed to go to work, you're allowed to go to school, you're allowed to conduct your normal daily routines without any interruption. Just the 8 days of Chanukah are just very, very festive. What I'd like to do next now is to go into some more interpretive teachings of and about Chanukah to see how we can understand the deeper meaning of the festival. Now, as we know today in modern times in America especially, Chanukah comes out at Christmas time, and there's a lot of confusion, especially amongst people who are not that knowledgeable about Chanukah. They think it's a kind of Jewish Christmas, a kind of Jewish way of celebrating a holiday. And of course, you have, unfortunately, intermarried families. So whilst Christians have a Christmas bush, Jews try to have a Chanukah bush. Unfortunately, these things happen. There's a thing called Chrismukah, a cross between Christmas and Chanukah, and it's very ironic because Chanukah is the essentially Jewish holiday. It's decreed by the rabbis. It's not even decreed by the Torah. It's only hinted at in the Torah. It's derived from various teachings in the Torah, which I'm going to touch upon. So it's very ironic that secular, assimilated, intermarried, even Christian people, Jews who've become Christian, celebrate this holiday, which really, in terms of logic and in history, doesn't make any sense. In Israel, of course, you have the celebration of Chanukah among the secular Israelis. Unfortunately, the meaning of Chanukah is lost because they view it as some kind of modern day, their history as some kind of modern day version of Chanukah, which in some ways it is, but just to see Chanukah in a militaristic light as some kind of a series of military victories paralleling Israel's military victories, or vice versa, Israel's military victories paralleling the victories of the Maccabees against the Greeks, is to miss the deeper meaning and the whole point of Chanukah, as it's something that's drawn from Torah teaching, as we'll see. Now, next point is, I mentioned this earlier, is that there were basically two kinds of Greeks. So there were two Greek onslaughts. There was the cultural and the military, two types of onslaughts that came from the Greek people, symbolized or embodied by the two different types of Greeks, the Ptolemies of Egypt, who were Hellenizers. The word Hellenize means to become Greek. It's from the Greek word for Greece. Greece in Greek is called Hellas. So Hellenization is the becoming of a Greek. And then the Seleucids were more militaristic and aggressive, and they were in the area of Syria, and they confronted the Jewish people. Now, there were hundreds of thousands of Jews that lived in Egypt, and many of them, probably most of them, had become assimilated and Hellenized. They followed in the ways of the Greeks, and they developed a love for Greek philosophy and Greek culture. You know, the heritage of it's the Western heritage. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and other Greek thinkers and philosophers, Greek architecture, Greek art, the Greek language, music, aesthetics. It was a great world culture, and it flourished in Ptolemaic Egypt, where hundreds of thousands of Jews lived and were caught up in this. They even had a famous Jewish philosopher over there by the name of Philo. He rewrote the Torah according to the ideas of Greek philosophy, various schools of thought, trying to align the Torah with that. The Torah was translated into Greek in Ptolemy. One of the Ptolemaic kings translated the Torah into Greek. Whilst with the Seleucids, they were into like forcing the Jews to stop observing Judaism. Famous story of Hannah and her sons, that one of the Greek kings or generals threw a ring down, her sons refused to bow down to even pick up his ring, even the youngest of her children, and basically they were all killed. And she committed suicide in the end when she saw what happened. So that's the background as far as the two types of the Greek assault against the Jewish people. Now let's just stop here and take lots of steps back to see where the concept of light, because after all, Chanukah is a festival of light, right? Chanukah celebrates light. It's lit with a menorah. You're only supposed to enjoy the light. There's a deeper meaning in the light. What is this light? So if you look in the Torah, you'll see that at the very beginning in the book of Genesis, in Bereshit, there is the mention of light and dark. Breshit bar Elokim et hashamayim va'aretz hayta tov v'haba b'choshech ha'pnei tehom v'yomer Elokim yehi or v'yehi or. At the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and there was a great darkness upon the deep, and then God said, "Let there be light." So that light that God said, "Let there be light," is an unusual light, because the question is, what type of light was it? Was it the sun? So there's a problem, because the sun is created a few days later when God creates the luminaries, the stars, the moon, the sun, and the constellations, the universes, everything around us beyond planet Earth. So what is that original light? So it's called an Or Haganuz. In fact, the rabbinical commentators say that God saw that this light was too powerful for the world. It was too good for the world. So he hid it away for the righteous at the end of time, or in the world to come. It was an unusual light. So that first light is a tremendous light. And that light lit up the darkness. It said there was a darkness. So spoiler alert, the reference to darkness is a reference to the Greek kingdom, because they try to darken the eyes of the Jews, meaning, like, so to speak, metaphorically, poke out the eyes of the Jews, make them blind to their own heritage. You know, the difference between a person who can see and a person who's blind. A blind man cannot enjoy light. He lives in darkness. So the Greeks try to impose a cultural darkness to take away the flavor and the style of the Torah that the Jews had been accustomed to, and exchange that for Greek philosophy. Philosophy means lover of wisdom, philosophos, lover of wisdom. So again, spoiler alert, that original Or Haganuz, that original light, is the light of Chanukah. It's reflected in the Chanukah menorah. It came shining through. That's why the miracle of Chanukah happened through light, because it was the Or Haganuz. It was the hidden light from the time of creation that shone through, and it was a different aura, a different type of light, a different manifestation of light that is symbolized and is actualized and is actually in the lights of Chanukah. So that's part of the holiness. In fact, we say in the prayers of Chanukah, we say, "Ein lanu reshut lehishtamesh bahen ela lirotan bilvad." We don't have permission to use these lights at all, only to look at them. Only to look at them. That's the mitzvah of the light. And there's stories of great rabbis who would just sit there, sometimes not even blinking, and just enjoying the light for hours on end, because there is this secret of the supernal light. It's good for you. It's a healing light. It's a miraculous light. It's a special light. It's not just any old light. That's why it's not good to do the Chanukah menorah with electrical lights. I mean, if you absolutely have no choice. But the mitzvah is to do it with olive oil or wax candles, preferably olive oil with a cotton wick. They sell them in Jewish bookstores. If you don't have access to a Jewish bookstore near you, you can take a little shot glass, or if you have a candelabrum, if you have a Chanukah menorah, also in Israel they call it Chanukiah, a menorah. You get pure kosher olive oil if it has an OU, or if you can get kosher olive oil from Israel, or kosher olive oil in your supermarket. Bartanoros any olive oil is good, as long as it has an OU, a kosher sign on it. And you pour in that light, and then you take a cotton wick, and it's actually very easy to make. You take a little strip of cotton, you take from a cotton ball, take off a little bit, and then twirl it in your fingers until it becomes a wick. And you stick that in, and you'll be surprised. When you light it, it will burn beautifully. Stick that into the little menorah with the cup that holds the little bit of oil. Stick the wick into the oil, and it will burn beautifully. It'll give off a nice radiant white light. And so you get a special mitzvah over there. So that's one instance where you see the Torah prepares, has a message that connects with Chanukah eventually, the creation of light. When God says, Vayehi Or, that light will be the Or HaGanuz, the hidden light that is part of the essence of the Chanukah lights. Let's take a few steps further in the Torah. There's an episode with Noah. After the flood, he blesses, he has sons, and he blesses his three sons. His sons are Shem, Ham, and Yafet. Shem, Ham, and Yafet, each, according to Torah thinking, is the progenitor of the basic races and nations of the world. Shem is the progenitor of the Asiatic, Middle Eastern and Asiatic nations, Jewish people included. Ham is the progenitor of the African nations. And Yafet is the progenitor of the European, most of the European nations. The name Yafet, Japheth, he gets a special blessing of beauty. His name also means beauty, like the Hebrew word for beauty is Yafeh. There's a name for a girl called, the Hebrew name for a girl, Yafa, which means beauty, beautiful. So Yafet means the one who is beautiful, and it says that Noah gave him a blessing of may the beauty of Yafet dwell in the tents of Shem. In other words, the role of Yafet is to glorify and beautify Shem. Shem is the learner of Torah. He's a dweller in tents. He's a learner of Torah, especially as crystallized and eventually down the line through the Jewish people. And the role of Yafet is to beautify that, to add glamour, to add beauty, to add aesthetics to it, but not to displace Shem, not to displace Torah with philosophy. In fact, Greek is considered to be the most beautiful language, according to the Jewish sages, according to the Talmud. The most beautiful language on earth. If somebody asks you, which is supposed to be the most beautiful language on earth, everybody will have a different favorite, of course. So according to Judaism, the most beautiful language on earth is classical Greek. There we are. And not only that, but a Torah may be written in Greek, in classical Greek. The only other language that a Torah is allowed to be written in is Greek, whether it's Greek letters or Greek translation, but a Torah is allowed to be written with Greek lettering. The only language that makes a Torah kosher, it's not done today, but it is technically permissible and allowable. Why? Because Greek is the most beautiful of languages. So that's Yafet. And that's the Greeks. Greek architecture, Greek art, Greek music, the Olympics, glorification of the body, music, culture, aesthetics, refinement. That's philosophy, intellect, science, intellectualism. This is the way of the Greeks. This was their tradition. That's why we still have to this very day the roots of Western civilization, the Greco-Roman culture. Greece and Rome. Rome took over the culture of the Greeks. The Greeks, even though Rome conquered the Greeks, but it took over their culture, lock, stock, and barrel. And in fact, later when the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire continued, and their culture and language was Greek. It was a Greek-Roman culture. And the other part of Western civilization is the so-called Judeo-Christian heritage, which is made up of Judaism and then Christianity, that provides the ethics and the morality. So that touches on those. So the problem with the Greeks at the time of Chanukah was that Yafet tried to usurp Shem. The original blessing, the balance of power was that it should be Shem, Ham, and Yafet, and that Japheth should be an ancillary to Shem. He should not usurp him. But what happened at the time of Hellenization and Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire was that the Greeks tried to usurp and crush and move aside Shem's domain of Torah. So they tried to displace Torah with philosophy. They tried to displace the Jewish way of life with the Greek way of life. They tried to Hellenize. They didn't only do it to the Jews, they did it to everyone. But the problem was for them, for the Greeks, when it came to the Jews had just as a sophisticated world system of Weltanschauung and philosophical outlook and theological, ideological, and religious outlook that went as deep or deeper than the Greeks' ideas. So they were they were stumped by the Jews and the Jewish traditions of Torah learning and Jewish intellectualism, because the Jews also value intellectual endeavor, especially study of the Torah and the oral law, the oral Torah. So that was another segment. Now there's another section of the Torah that also hints at Chanukah. We've touched so far on Genesis. Genesis, the Or HaGanuz, the hidden light of creation, is reflected in the light of Chanukah. We touched on the blessing that was given to Shem, Ham, and Yafet, Noah's blessings to his sons, that Yafet was supposed to be play second fiddle, if you like, or ancillary to Shem. That Yafet's philosophy is not meant to usurp Shem's Torah, so we see that at the time of Noah. Then there's another reference to Chanukah, and this has to do in the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. There's a section there which talks about the dedication of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. That was the portable temple that they had in the wilderness for 40 years, and then later when they came to Israel, they worshipped through the tabernacle before the Jewish temple was built. King David conquered Jerusalem, and then his son Solomon built the permanent temple, the first temple in Jerusalem. But before that, they had the tabernacle, and when they consecrated the tabernacle, the various princes of the tribes brought, the 12 Jewish tribes brought gifts to consecrate at the consecration of the temple in honor of the temple, the tabernacle's inauguration. So the head priest was Aaron HaKohen. Aaron, the brother of Moses, was the high priest, the first high priest. And it says when he saw that the princes were bringing all these various gifts, he says he felt bad. He had a chalishas hadas, like a kind of depression. Why am I not involved? I'd also like to dedicate. So it says, the commentators say, God, so to speak, said to him, yours will be greater than theirs, because in the future the Jewish people are going to have a festival of Chanukah, which will be inaugurated by your descendants, the priests and the high priests, that will become a festival that will be observed for 2,000 years. In other words, the tabernacle was consecrated and stood for about, let's say, 300 and something years. The first temple stood for about 400 years, 410 years, 420 years. The second temple also stood for about 410 years. So if you add up all the times of the first and second temple, plus the tabernacle, it's about 1,200 years. It's still not as long combined as the time in which we've been celebrating Chanukah. Each time a Jew or the Jewish people celebrate Chanukah, they're reenacting the lighting of the menorah. The menorah was that part of the tabernacle which shone light, through which the miracle of Chanukah was done. The menorah represents Torah. So in the future, the Hasmoneans will establish a festival that will last 2,000 years, so that every Jew, so to speak, will become a high priest, a miniature high priest. So that's what we are. We are like little Aaron HaKohens, even a non-priest. In my case, I'm not a priest. You're not. If you're not a Kohen or a Levi, you're not a priest. You're not from the priestly caste, from the priestly families, but you are, so to speak, enacting the roles of the Jewish high priests every time you light up a Chanukah menorah, because that's what the high priest did. He lit up the menorah in the temple. He made sure that it was burning bright in the temple, first in the tabernacle, then in the temple, the first temple and the second temple. It was an integral part. There were different parts of inside the temple. There was the Ark of the Covenant that had the Ten Commandments inside. There were the cherubs on top of the Ark of the Covenant. There was the showbread, the lechem apanim. There was an altar, a mizbeach. There was an altar for incense. Different parts of the temple where sacrificial offerings and symbolic offerings were offered over there, where there were wine offerings. There was even a water libation on Sukkot time. So that's another example of where Chanukah is mentioned, is hinted, is implied in the Torah. So you have the light of creation is the light of Chanukah. You have the blessing given to Shem, Ham, and Yafet, that Yafet was supposed to be great and beauteous and beautiful, but he usurped that at the time of Chanukah. And then you have the dedication of the temple by Aaron, and God says to him, your portion will be greater than theirs, because eventually there will be a festival called Chanukah, which will be done through the lighting of a menorah and of lights. So those are three instances where you see the Torah roots of Chanukah. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the four empires. There are in Torah thought, there are supposed to be four empires: Babylonian, Bavel, Paras, Yavan, and Edom. Babylonia, Persia, and Media, they were a combined empire, Greece, and then Rome. And each one had distinct features. Babylonia had the feature of exile, exiling the people. Of course, they conquered and they imposed themselves and they had idol worship, but the main emphasis was on conquering and exiling the people. So they conquered the Jews of the kingdom of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar conquered them, and he sent them into an exile into Babylonia, where they were until modern times, for over 2,500 years. Until modern times, until the rise of fundamentalist Islam, and Jews were kicked out of the Arab countries and Persia. Then you had the Persian Empire. Their hallmark and trademark is as it's told in the Purim story, the scroll of Esther says that Haman, he tried lahashmid laharag la'abed, to destroy, to annihilate, to kill, in a word, genocide, like in the Holocaust. Their policy was kill them out. No exile, no mercy, just kill them out, stamp them out, destroy them. So that's the hallmark of Persia. Greece, their hallmark was Hellenization. There was Yavanim and Misyavnim, Yavanim and Mityavnim, Greeks and Hellenizers. Hellenizers in Hebrew are called Mityavnim. So the miracle of Chanukah is that not only were the Yavanim, the Greeks, defeated, but the Mityavnim were also defeated through the efforts of the Hashmonaim and of the Jewish people, through the growth of Torah. They tried to suppress Torah, and instead the oral law grew and became very powerful at that time. The final exile is Rome. That's the one we're in now. Edom. Edom means red, because the symbol of Rome is red. And their their trademark is a combination of all the others. Each part of the Roman exile has been a repeat of the others. They're not originators. They are copycats. They are what's that word? Somebody who copies somebody else's methodology. So the first phase of Rome, vis-a-vis the Jewish people, was a Babylonian type of phase of exile. Of course, they try to impose idol worship, the worship of the Roman gods, just like the Greeks did eventually, imposing the worship of the Greek gods. But the first phase was war and then exile, just like the Babylonians exiled the Jewish people to Babylonia when they destroyed the first temple. The Romans exiled the Jewish people throughout the Roman Empire when they burnt down and defeated the Jewish people at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple 2,000 years ago. The next phase of Rome, let's call it the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, is a Persian phase of genocide, pogroms, inquisitions, crusades. What was that about? Eventually, they call it the biggest crusade was the Holocaust, even stretching into modern times. Annihilating the Jewish people. This was the policy of lahashmid, laharag, la'abed, to destroy, to annihilate, to kill, to completely wipe out the Jewish people, genocide. So that's it. That was the so-called Dark Ages, when the Jews suffered from pogroms and crusades and inquisitions, and eventually the Holocaust as well. The final phase is the Greek phase. From the time, you could say, of the Renaissance, it starts already in the 1200s. There's a first Renaissance. Then the 1500s, the rise of science, the rise of secular knowledge, enlightenment, secularization, the leisure age, the information technology. We see it so much in our times. This is all part of the Hellenization of culture, that the emphasis is not so much on exile. The emphasis is not so much on genocide. The emphasis is much more on cultural assimilation. And we see in the last 100, 200 years, the majority of the Jewish people have moved from being a religiously observant people to becoming a secular, even very intermarried people, assimilated and intermarried. The three stages of that is there's assimilation, then there's intermarriage, then there's apostasy. Apostasy means assimilation comes just through cultural assimilation, not intermarriage. Then you have intermarriage, where Jews marry non-Jews. And then the final stage is apostasy, where Jews reject their Judaism and adopt a foreign religion. In most cases in the Western world today, it's Christianity. See, so many Jews have abandoned Judaism and practice Christianity. So that's a tragedy. And at the very end of time, as we see in our days, all the manifestations of the exiles will come to be. Exile, like we see, let's say the Jews of Russia were exiled, were kicked out of Russia. The Jews of the Arab lands were kicked out. After the Holocaust, the Jews were refugees and kicked out. So you have a Babylonian type of exile going on in modern times for the Jewish people. You have genocide going on. The Holocaust was the biggest example of that. It happened in modern times at the height of acculturalization. Germany was a very cultured nation, the most Greek of the nations. Yet it reverted to the most barbarous of policies that you had in the time of Haman, as told in the Purim story of lahashmid, laharag, la'abed, to completely destroy and kill and annihilate. And then finally, cultural assimilation. And there's one more, I'll just throw this in since we're on the topic. There's another aspect to the exiles, and that is the exile of Yishmael. The final exile, they say, will be the exile of Yishmael, which we also see in our times, the Jewish people in Israel surrounded by the Arab nations, and Arabs both inside of Israel and outside of Israel being against Israel and against the Jewish people, fighting all these wars with terrorism and all kinds of trying to do all kinds of boycotts and things like that. BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israel, trying to persuade the world to abandon Israel and to go against Israel and to fight Israel. So that's the exile of Yishmael thrown into this mix. Okay, so we touched upon the 4 exiles, and we are now in the latter stage of that. I'm talking about in history. Let's talk a little bit about the miracle of the menorah. The temple lights, the menorah lights of the temple shone from the inside to the outside. Usually light comes in, I'm talking about under natural circumstances. I'm not talking about where today we have electricity, but before that, light came from sunshine, light came from the outside, and it shone in to the inside of a house. At night, basically, what did people have? 1 or 2 candles, and then they went to sleep? There was basically people went to sleep with the chickens and the birds. Very few people would stay up at night because it would be dangerous and expensive. You needed a candle or a big fat torch to burn. Only much later, in modern times, we had gas lighting and we had electrical lighting now. But that's only the last 150 years. For thousands of years in history, light meant daylight. So daylight comes from a window on the outside to the inside. In the temple, it was the opposite. The light shone from the temple to the outside. From the light of the menorah, it shone out into the outside world. So it lit up the world. It was the paradoxical opposite of the way light, the function of light. Now, the light of the menorah represents the light of Torah, or Torah, or rather, Torah is compared to light. There's a verse in the book of Proverbs that says that ki ner mitzvah v'Torah or. The ner mitzvah, the candle is like a mitzvah, is like a commandment, and the Torah is like light. The Torah or. Torah is light. So if you think of a candle, you think of a light, there's the physical light, so that's symbolic of the mitzvot. These are physical things we do with our bodies, tefillin, eating kosher, setting in a sukkah, a mezuzah. These are all things we do in a physical, in a physical domain, right? Wearing a talit, wearing a hair covering. These are all things we do in the physical domain. But the Torah is in the abstract. That's like light. The light that shines forth from a candle or from a light is the non-physical, so to speak, spiritual, ethereal part of the totality of what's happening. So that's what the book of Proverbs says, ner mitzvah v'Torah or. So you see that the Torah is called or in the book of Proverbs. Mishlei, it says, ner mitzvah v'Torah or. The candle is called a mitzvah. So what we're looking at here, when we're looking at the menorah, is the oil or the candle represents mitzvahs, commandments. That's what it is. Focus yourself. It's not jingle bells and ho, ho, ho and all that stuff, and Mary, Mary and all that stuff. It's about a mitzvah, focusing on mitzvahs. You should do mitzvahs, improve your mitzvahs, want to do mitzvahs, commandments. And the light is the symbolic of Torah. You should think of the Torah, of the intellectual part, study, immerse yourself, make yourself curious, ask a question. That's the way Chanukah is introduced in the Talmud. My Chanukah, what is Chanukah? Starts with a question, what's Chanukah? And then they go into a whole discussion of what Chanukah is. In addition to which, we know that the Jewish people in the Tanakh, in the book of Isaiah, are called an Or Lagoyim, light unto the nations. So what is this about? Just as the Chanukah lights send light at night when it's dark from the inside to the outside, just as the lights of the temple send light from the inside to the outside. So the Jewish people send light from themselves to the entire world. They're an Or Lagoyim. a light unto the nations. That's a famous description of the Jewish people. Or lagoyim, a light to the nations, from the book from the book of Isaiah, Yeshayahu. And of course, God himself is compared to a great light. There's a famous story of a Roman philosopher or general who confronted a rabbi and said, "Show me your God." So the rabbi said, "I can't show you my God. He's invisible." He says, "Aha, you see," the Roman says, "so he doesn't exist." So the rabbi says, "Wait a minute. You see that sun? Yes. Look at it. Stare at it." So the Roman says, "It's impossible. If I stare at the sun, I'll harm myself. I could go blind." We know you can't keep staring at the sun. You'll damage your eyes, and you can go blind from that. So the rabbi said, "You see, if the sun, which is one of God's creations, and it shines so bright that you cannot look at it, so how can you expect to look and to see the Creator himself? The sun itself is one of his creations." So these are metaphors. The light of the sun itself is symbolic of the power of God. It's not God, which, by the way, there were many people that worship the sun worshippers and moon worshippers. Maybe they're called lunatics, but sun worshiping was a common thing because of its power. It would rise in one part of the world. Sun rises in the east and sets in the west. It rules the day. At night, it's dark. A lot of primitive people, and even not so primitive people, were sun worshippers, have been sun worshippers. But that's wrong. The sun is only one of God's emissaries. In fact, Maimonides says that's how idol worship actually started. The road down the path, the slippery slope down idol worship started that way, that people started to say, well, let's give honor to the stars and the moon and the sun because these are God's luminaries, and by giving honor to his servants, to those that work for him, like the sun and the moon and the stars, we're giving honor to him. And then later generations forgot that altogether, the connection that God is the one who created the sun and the stars and the moon and everything else, and they just started worshiping the sun itself. And then later they started making a symbol, an idol that represented the stars and the sun and the moon and what have you. So it was a slippery slope. And the point I'm trying to make is God is compared to a great light, and the sun is a symbol of that. All light is connected. So when you're looking at the menorah and you're looking at the lights of the menorah, you're actually looking at a powerful facet of God, and that's light. And what the Greeks try to do, of course, is to extinguish that light. They try to extinguish that light of Torah, that light, the soul of a Jew. Nishmas Adam ner, Nishmas Adam, I forget the exact quote, that the soul of a person is like a candle light, that the soul within us is also like a light that burns bright. So the Greeks try to stamp that out and impose their way of thinking. Think about it. When you get immersed in philosophy and in psychology and in science and in all these things, and then all of a sudden you wake up and think, you're an atheist. What does the word atheist mean? It's a Greek word, atheos. There is no God. There's no God. Atheos, there's no God. And this is what the Greeks came up with. And in order to combat that, at the time, the rabbis teach, I'm talking about at the time of Chanukah, that to combat the intellectual challenges of Hellenization and of the Greeks, the rabbis expanded the role of the oral law, of the Torah Shebe'al Peh, to become an intellectual adversary and overshadow Greek philosophy. What the Greeks tried to do, in essence, was to remove the Tainug HaTorah, the flavor of Torah, and replace it with a different sort of flavor altogether. It's a kind of intellectual and spiritual castration. So our job really, when we light the Chanukah menorah, is to return to the Or HaGanuz, to the hidden light, and to be aware of all these deeper meanings as we light up the Chanukah menorah. I wish you a Chag Chanukah Sameach, a Freilichen Chanukah, which means a joyous Chanukah in Yiddish. Have a happy Chanukah, and may we soon see the salvation of the Jewish people and peace on earth. Thank you.